Amazing trying to think about what God thinks about and what God feels. For certainly he does feel. Esther chapter 8 this morning. Esther 8. Here's a question for you. What holds you back? What holds you back? You ever thought about that? We all have dreams. We all have goals. We all have desires. We have ambitions. What holds you back? Along with those things, we all have obstacles, and this is probably the part we're more familiar with. I, some days, am more familiar with the obstacles in my life than I am with the dreams and the ambitions and the aspirations, though I don't lack those either. But what holds us back from overcoming our obstacles? Sometimes we get a wall in front of us, and we just can't seem to get past it. I remember when I was a kid, one of the things that I grew up with dogs, which is interesting that I now have cats, but we grew up with German Shepherds as a kid, and German Shepherds are great dogs. They're not small dogs necessarily, but they're good dogs. They're very intelligent dogs, and they're just a good dog to have around. We grew up with them. We had a friend when I was a kid who had a Doberman Pinscher, which aside from being ugly as anything, they're stupid as a brick. Honestly, they're dumb. We made the mistake of taking our German Shepherd over to visit this family that had a Doberman Pinscher, and the reason it was a mistake was because they had a 3-foot fence keeping in a Doberman Pinscher, and the thing was so stupid it didn't know that it could cross it. I mean, it could look over top of it, but it never figured out that it could jump it. Well, we put our dog in the backyard, and 5 seconds later, he's in the front yard because he realized he could jump. And all of a sudden, the Doberman Pinscher goes, I can jump that. And they had to go buy a new fence. Sometimes in life, we feel a little bit like a Doberman Pinscher. Not I'm accusing any of you of being stupid, so please don't misunderstand. But sometimes we get an obstacle in our life that is something that can be gotten over or can be gotten around, and yet something seems to perpetually hold us back, keep us from actually getting around or over or past that obstacle. And I want us to think about what is it that holds us back. Now, if you're like me, you're probably going to reach for lack of resources in life. Of all of the obstacles I face and all of the opportunities I miss, I have 2 constant excuses I always reach to. Either I don't have the time or I don't have the money. Does that sound familiar at all to you? Or is it just me? And if it's just me, that's fine. I'll go get my own therapist and we can just call it a day. But no, I mean, I just feel like I don't have the time or I don't have the money. I just lack the resources to deal with said obstacle or to take advantage of said opportunity. But the reality is, when we stop to think about it, when I stop to think about it, that's not necessarily true. I have the same number of hours in my week as you do. Granted, I have a few more demands than some people in having, demanding children. Not that my children are ever demanding, but some of them are. But they require attention, and family does, and jobs do, and I get all that. And like most of us, we seem to find the money that we need to do the things that we really want to do. And so I'm not sure that time or money are really valid reasons. I think they tend to be more of an excuse. It pushes me back into the question of what holds me back, what holds you back. And I think if we were to spend some time thinking about it, it's not that we lack knowledge, and it's not that we lack resources. I think what we lack is sometimes permission. And that sounds weird, because as an adult, I don't lack permission for anything. And yet when I push at it, at least in my own mind, I find that permission tends to be a pretty big deal. Sometimes I have the knowledge, or I have the resources, or I have both, but I just don't give myself permission to kind of pull the trigger. I don't give myself permission to utilize my time or utilize my resources to do or to overcome whatever the obstacle is that I face in my life. Now, as we get closer to the end of Esther's story, here we are in Esther chapter 8, and we're kind of approaching the end of the story. We're not quite all the way there. We actually will wrap this up, chapters 9 and 10, both next week. So we're almost near the end. But as we get near the end of Esther's story, what we find is that God's plan is in full swing. We saw early on, the Jews were facing a really an extinction level event for them. That somebody had, was kind of a Hitler wanted to slaughter all the Jews, and he had set a plan in place to do just that. But what we saw was that God had a plan in place before this guy even hatched his plot. Before this guy named Haman ever decided he wanted to kill the Jews, God knew he was coming and already had a plan of salvation, already had a plan of deliverance underway before he ever even hatched his plan. And so, we find that this thing was already going on. When we get to chapter 8, what we find is God's plan is further ahead than Haman's plan ever was. And we find Esther, and we find her cousin slash, adopted dad, Mordecai, in this position where they have the plan in place, they have the resources, and they just need the permission to go ahead and do it. And sometimes Nike does actually get it right, just do it. And so what we see here in chapter 8 is they just need the permission to move forward with their part of God's plan. And that's what we see in Esther chapter 8. And there's actually 4 things, and I have them there on the back of your program if you're looking. Makes it maybe easier to keep notes, whatever. I know some of you school kids, I saw report cards came out, and you're like, church notes was a deal. So I try to make it easy for you. Put it on the program. Just turn in your program. Half of the work's already done. Anyway, I digress. The first permission that we see here, we see in the first couple verses of Esther 8, is the permission to possess. We find, beginning in verse 1, on that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. 2 things come into possession here to Mordecai and Esther. The first of those things is Haman's position. Haman, if you'll remember or if you don't know, Haman had actually had ascended right up to be the second in command of the entire Persian Empire. Ahasuerus, Xerxes, liked Haman, and we're not told why or what circumstances led to that, but he got to this position of authority where Xerxes just kind of gave him free reign over the Persian Empire. He was prime minister, grand vizier, call him what you want. He was the number 2 guy in the whole empire, and that was his position. And we find that in this moment, as Esther, the queen, introduces Mordecai to the king, that he actually puts Mordecai into that position. Haman, if you'll remember, had been hung earlier in that day. He was no longer there. Suddenly there was a job opening and a qualified candidate, and the king said, done. And so he moved Mordecai into that. You think about it, Mordecai had already had the king's esteem. Though they didn't have a relationship, the king was still alive in some respects because of a plot that Mordecai had uncovered and had shared. And so the king already esteemed him, and now suddenly he's just, wow, you're related to the queen, and you're a good guy. And so he puts him right into that position. Now, what's interesting about Mordecai in this position as one of the king's chief advisors, as the second most powerful man on planet Earth, really, at this moment in time, he no longer is required to get permission to come into the king's presence. His presence with the king is assumed and it is granted. He can walk into the king basically anytime his own personal discretion allows. And there is, that whole thing that Esther had to go through, walking into the court, waiting for the king to raise the scepter to her. Mordecai just bypasses all of that. Now he has unfettered, constant access to the king. The king wants him around. And so this is a serious position. Aside from, the wealth and prestige and power and everything that goes with it, he's got access to the king as well. That comes into play. The second thing that comes into their possession is the house of Haman. Now, one of the things Herodotus, the Greek historian, tells us is that Persian kings were often wont to do is they would seize the entire estate of somebody who was deemed a criminal, which in this case, Haman was. And so Xerxes just seized the entire estate of Haman, not a small estate. So he has a house there in Shushan, in the capital. He has a lot of wealth. I mean, we were talking a couple weeks ago, what was it, like 72 tons of silver? I mean, there's loaded, and then there's just ridiculous. Haman fell into the latter of those categories, ridiculous. Not only did he have 72 tons of silver to spend, the king decided, don't spend your own money, I'll give you 72 tons of silver to do this. And so you put those together, and he doubled his wealth. Very wealthy guy, very wealthy estate, had wealth, had riches, had servants. And the king seized all of that, and he gave it to Esther. Now, Esther's the queen. What does she lack for in the palace? Nothing. Does she need a house? Not really. Does she need just an absolute ridiculous amount of wealth? No, she's just anything that she asks for as the queen, she gets. And so she appoints Mordecai over the house of Haman. So now Mordecai, he's moved into this position of prestige with the king, and he moves into this position to basically own, though not directly, all of Haman's holdings. And so he gets a new house, and he gets a lot of wealth, and he gets a 75-foot gallows, which just might come in handy, I don't know. And he gets all of this, everything that was Haman's is now belongs to the queen, but has been given over to Mordecai for use. And so they have permission now to possess all of these things that the king is giving to them. It is an amazing amount of resources. It's an amazing amount of access. It's an amazing amount of influence that he gives to them, but it doesn't stop there. This is going to start to feel like an infomercial after a few minutes. It doesn't stop there because he also gives permission to speak. And we see this in verse 3, and this is where Mordecai's relationship with the king comes in handy. You think about it, this is the same day now. Stop back just a second and think. This is the same day. Sometimes we talk about, we've looked at text and we're like, from this verse to this year, 10 years elapsed. Yeah, well, this verse to this verse, 10 minutes have elapsed. It literally is the same day. This day has been an eventful day. The day started off with Mordecai being paraded around the capital. Remember, the king couldn't sleep, so he had them read the book of the king to the king. And he's like, hey, I remember this guy who did me well, and I want to promote him, and I want to honor him. And so he made Haman parade Mordecai around the capital. That was that morning. Later that day, Haman, after doing that, he goes home and he reports all this stuff to his wife and to his advisor. And they said, look, if that's what's really happening, you might be in trouble. Turns out those were truer words were never spoken because Haman then ends up going to the banquet, the luncheon with the king and the queen and Haman, this great deal. And it's at this luncheon on the same day that Esther reveals her heritage to the king and says, look, somebody is trying to kill all the Jews. And the king is outraged. He's like, who's doing this? And she's like, him. You had a bad day, Haman. And the king is furious, and he walks out of the room to count to 10. Meanwhile, Haman decides he's going to start begging for his life, and he trips over the queen's couch as she's reclining as the king walks back in with Haman laying on the queen's couch. And the king just about lost it. Actually, he didn't just about lost it. He did lost it. And so he had Haman killed on Haman's own gallows and gave all. So all of this is happening on the exact same day that we're looking at. And so the setting now, as we move into verse 3, and as we move into these verses in chapter 8, the setting has moved really from this, the queen's side of the palace where this luncheon was taking place, back out to the throne room where the king is now dispensing justice and seizing property and promoting people and doing all the kingly things that kings tend to do. And so that's kind of this setting. Now Mordecai, his new position, he's there. This is his job. This is his role. He's there in the king's palace. He's there in the king's presence. Esther, interestingly enough, as the queen, no longer has still doesn't have the same access to the king that even Mordecai does. Now, Mordecai has 24-hour access to the king. Esther still has to get permission to talk to the king. It's a weirdness. she's the queen, but that's just her role in the kingdom was not as forward as his. And so, she could go in, but if he didn't raise the scepter, I mean, they had guards there with spears that they were not afraid to use them. And so, we find her in verse 3 running into, and we need to set the scene to make sure you don't misunderstand. She's running into the throne room now to talk to her husband, the king, but still under this requirement to get his permission to even be there under pains of death. So we jump into verse 5. She gets permission to speak. She goes in, she literally falls at his feet, and he holds up the scepter, and she speaks. And here's what she says. If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? And so her plea, as she's given permission to speak, is to the king is, hey, revoke what's been done. Now, is there a problem with that request? What do we know about the law of the Medes and the Persians? It does not change. It is unchangeable. Once the king signs a law, the king himself is bound by the law, and he cannot change it. He cannot alter it. He cannot revoke it. And so Esther is literally laying herself out before the king and said, look, if you like me at all, if you love me, revoke the law that Haman had devised. Undo what's been done. Now, is that possible? No. The law of the Medes and Persians does not change. It is unalterable. And so the thing that she is asking is literally impossible. Which is just an interesting kind of an aside, but it kind of gives us some idea as to why the king responds the way he does. The thing that she has asked for, he cannot do. But he can do something. And so that's where we move into the next step. Not only does he give her permission to speak, he then extends permission to act. And we see these in verses 7 all the way down through verse 14, through much of the bulk of the chapter, is the permission that he gives to act. He can't do the thing that Esther has requested, but he can do something. And so here's what he decides to do. Look in verse 7. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew. Interesting again, this named heritage. He's still Mordecai the Jew. He's the second most powerful person on planet Earth, but he's Mordecai the Jew. Indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hands on the Jews. So I got rid of the source. I got rid of the irritant. Verse 8, you yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. So you get the end of that kind of hint, I cannot do what she wants me to do, but here's what I'm going to give you permission to do. I'm going to give you permission to write a new law. You write it any way you see fit. You write it any way you think is profitable and possible and helpful. He said, and then you sign it in my name, and you seal it with my ring, and you see to its distribution, and it will be whatever you decide. That's an interesting, it's kind of an interesting carte blanche. Here's Mordecai. I mean, he's day one on the job, and the king said, here's my ring, here's my pen, go write a law, sign it, seal it, send it, whatever you want to do is what you can do. That's a staggering amount of power day one of your job. Like you're forget running the company, you're running the country. Day one, that's not too bad. And so the king can't give Esther what she's asked for, but he can do something. And so he gives them permission to act. He's done what he can. He destroyed Haman. He got rid of all that. He gave Mordecai and Esther all of his possessions. He's done all that. He has already entrusted Mordecai with his signet ring, with a fantastic amount of power to speak on the king's behalf. And so what does Mordecai do? He summons the scribes. He gives a summons for all of the king's scribes to come in so that he can draft this new law. And the new law that he drafts says that the Jews have permission to aggressively defend themselves against anyone who would try to destroy them. And as they defend themselves, not only can they kill the people who are the aggressors, but they can take their families and they can take all of their property and seize all of that. And so it's basically Haman's law, but it's kind of in reverse. Instead of everybody attacking the Jews and killing them and seizing the property, the Jews are encouraged, stand together, defend yourselves against anybody who would attack, and anybody who attacks you, you can have all of their stuff. You can kill them and you can seize all of their property. And so this is the new law that Mordecai drafts, and he signs it in the king's name, and he seals it with the king's signet ring, and they send it by courier to all 127 provinces of the Persian Empire. Sends it out everywhere Haman's law had gone. Mordecai's new law goes as well. And so Haman's law is still in effect. On the day that's indicated on the law, anybody who wants to is allowed to try to destroy the Jews. But Mordecai's law is also in effect, and so the Jews are encouraged and given permission to not just lay down, but they should stand up and fight, and they should go ahead and overcome anybody who tries to overthrow them. And so you have these two laws. They don't contradict each other so much as just they ensure a bit of warfare in the process. But Mordecai and Esther are given this permission to act. And we find in verse 11, by these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together, protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. And so there we have the law in its kind of capsule form. And so it goes out, and that's not a bad deal for the Jews. I mean, they can't be secured. The law, Haman's law, can't be revoked, but this new law gives them a lot of push, a lot of power, a lot of impetus to stand together, to fight against anybody who attacks them, and then to seize their assets. And so there's a lot of risk that's involved now. If you're going to go just try to destroy the Jews on the day that the law gives you the authority to do it, you now have a lot more risk because they could end up killing you, then killing your kids, taking your property, and turning the tables. And so Esther and Mordecai have permission to act, and they extend that permission then to all the Jews living anywhere in the Persian Empire. And what's interesting is the response that people have. The Jews, you would figure, are celebrating. They're actually happy about this. I mean, the law of the Medes and the Persians can't be changed or revoked or altered, and so that much can't be done. But we got a new law that is equipping us, that is arming us, that is preparing us, it is giving us permission and encouragement to stand for ourselves. And so it was a time of great rejoicing. As the letter was going out, every city it was read in, there was a party in the Jewish quarter of that city, in that province, that day. And it was almost like a holiday, festival kind of a thing as people celebrated what was coming. And we find then that Mordecai experiences, and I don't want to say he's given, because this is something that you aren't given so much as you have to just own, the permission to be. You think about it, what was Mordecai's position in the empire? Important? Powerful, second in command, grand vizier, prime minister, call it what you want. I'm not sure what the title actually would have been. It doesn't really matter. Just this very important person. Now, how do very important people traverse the world? Importantly, right? I mean, when you're large and in charge, it's hard to be anything else. And when you roll up with Secret Service and the whole thing, somebody's there, right? And so this is Mordecai. He just has the permission to be this person that he is. It's for him to roll up as prime minister is not to pretend to be something he isn't. It's just to be what he actually is. And so here's what we find in verse 15. So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. Mordecai, when he rolled up, was exactly who you would expect somebody that important to look like and to be. He wore the garments of state. He wore the crown of state. He walked around having authority and power, not as a poser or a pretender, but because he actually had authority and power. It would have been disingenuous. It would have been phony and fake of him to try to roll up as Mordecai the Jew who's opened the king's door for him. Wasn't that long ago that was his job. But were Mordecai the prime minister to run down to the gate and decide he was just going to open the door for people, that'd have been weird, wouldn't it? That actually would have been, you could call it humility, but really it's pride kind of masquerading as humility as he tries to be something that he now isn't. He's not a doorman anymore. He's the prime minister. It's time to be the prime minister. And so he actually has permission to be who he is. He walks around just being prime minister. The Jews have permission to celebrate this. They everywhere throughout the city, that the decree is read everywhere that Mordecai goes, he's a celebrity. They just have permission to celebrate the good news, the good actions, the good things that are befalling to them. Now, what's interesting about the Jews as they celebrate Mordecai and as they celebrate their deliverance is it hadn't happened yet. The Jews had a path to overcoming their destruction, but it hadn't been carried out yet. We're still about 9 months away from these twin laws coming into effect. We're in the 3rd month. They don't come into effect till the 12th month. And so they had a path to avoiding destruction, but they still had to walk that path. They still had to get there. They had the favor of the king, though, and that's no small thing. Everyone who heard the decree realized that something had happened in Shushan, that for whatever reason, and we're not sure why the king sent out this decree to annihilate the Jews, but he just sent out a decree encouraging the Jews to annihilate anybody who tried, and everybody made a mental note. The king likes the Jews. Whatever else may be said, they were in favor, and that was a good thing for the Jews. And really, it was a good thing for everybody. There were a lot of people who were glad about that. And what we find as we get to the end of the chapter here is they had a tremendous amount of sway over the people. The people knew the king favored them. The people knew that they were afraid to stand against the Jews. And there were quite a few people who actually became Jews as a result of this. Now, that's kind of the odder part. You're like, well, they just became, yeah, because you could become a Jewish proselyte just like anything else. And so people were so fond of the Jews and so impressed by all that had happened, that God had done, that the king had done, that they just said, we want to, can we be one of you? That's a pretty cool dynamic. When all of a sudden, you're the in crowd and everybody's trying to get in. And that's exactly what happened with the Jews in this. And so, as we close chapter 8 out, though the story has some gas left in it, some time left in it, we're still walking down this path toward these laws taking effect and possible annihilation and or possible deliverance. But as we come to the end of chapter 8, things seem to be turning out okay. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, this seems to be going in a good direction for Esther and Mordecai and for the Jews. They still face this difficult obstacle of this law, but there is a plan in place and there is the permission they need to make it work. So getting back to my original question, what holds you back? What about your life? When you look at your life and you look at the obstacles that you face and you look at the opportunities that are there before you, do you get the same sense that everything is going to work out okay? That's a tough question because we don't always feel that. We see the obstacles in our life and they look huge. They may only be a 3-foot fence, but they look monstrous and we cannot figure out what is the way forward. And the way forward is simply not that we need knowledge, not that we need resources necessarily, but we need permission in order to feel secure. We need permission to know that we can just do whatever needs to be done. And so the question is, what permission do you need in order to feel secure? There's 4 of them here. The permission to possess. We have constant access to the king. And not just a little king like a Persian king, but the king of the universe. We have constant access to the king, and we have access to the many resources of and from the king, who's actually already given us quite a few resources along the way, hasn't he? We should avail ourselves of both of those things, access to the king, resources from the king, when we're confronting the obstacles in our lives. Sometimes we just fail to possess the things that he's given us to possess and to do what needs doing. You have the permission to possess that access to the king and the permission to possess those things that he has given you to overcome obstacles. You have that permission. We have the permission to speak. Access to the king is only helpful if we take advantage of it. Mordecai had constant access to the king. If he never said boo to the king, it wouldn't have helped him. Esther was granted access to the king, but if she hadn't made a request, it wouldn't have helped her at all. Access to the king only is helpful if we take advantage of it. And not only does speaking to the king give us access to his heart and to his mind and to his resources, but it gives us the relief of venting our complaint. You ever felt like you were just burdened and people just didn't understand? Like the thing I'm going through, I look at the people in my life, even I look at my spouse or my siblings or my friends, and I'm like, I just don't think they get what I'm going through. We can actually take our complaint, much like Esther did. I mean, what she gave to the king was not the most dignified talk. It was raw, and it was emotional. She was asking for the impossible, but she was just sharing her fears and her frustrations. We have permission to speak. And when we think about, and we call it prayer, but we think about praying, we think about speaking to the king, and sometimes we over-dignify the process. Sometimes we think, oh, I have to be this way in God's presence, or I have to say this, or I can't say this. Why? What does God not know? Anyone? Is there anything that God doesn't know? No. So, is there really a reason to not tell him what's really on your heart and mind, like you're going to surprise him, or offend him, or shock him? He already knows those things are there. May as well be honest and just get it out, don't you think? We have permission to speak. And in speaking, we relieve ourselves of the angst and the fear and the frustration, and we have access to his heart and his mind and his resources. That's huge. We have permission to speak. We have permission to act. And here's sometimes where we don't miss it. We do miss it, rather. Sometimes we see an obstacle, and we have a plan, we have the knowledge, or we have the resources. We can figure out on our own selves how that we're going to get past this obstacle, but we feel like we shouldn't do it. We feel like, not for a moral reason, not for any other, but just like, it's like, you ever met somebody who you hand them an opportunity and they're like, well, let me pray about that. It's like, dude, really? Does your brain just so deficient that you can't figure out that God is the one who put that in your lap? And you need to spend a week praying. And I'm not, please don't say I'm dismissing prayer. It's important. I just talked about it. It's important. We need to do it. But there are times where we pray when we should be doing. We have permission to act. What would have happened if Mordecai and Esther just sat there praying the whole time? They'd have died praying. Because God had a plan in place. God gave them the resources. God gave them everything they need. But at the end of the day, they had to get up and they had to do something to carry out the plan. When we face obstacles, when we face opportunities, when we have some assurance that this is what God is doing and He's given us the knowledge and He's given us the resources, we have permission to act. It's not unspiritual, it's not ungodly to just go ahead and do what needs doing. Doesn't mean don't pray, but it means you need, at some point, you got to get up and start going. Jesus spent a lot of time in prayer, but He spent a lot of time doing, didn't He? Anybody who did anything in the Bible, we know they did it because they did it, not because they stayed at home praying. Both are required. Both are necessary. We have the permission to act. And here again, Nike says it. Just do it. And then finally, we have the permission to be. We have the permission to be. It is not pride or arrogance to have what you have or to be who you are. It's not pride or arrogance to have what you have or to be who you are. So many times we take the resources that God has given us, the plan that God has given us, and we hesitate to act, we hesitate to do because we don't want people to think that we're being proud. And so instead we're going to hold back and we're going to be humble, at least in our own eyes. Can I say to you that that kind of faux humility is really pride masquerading as humility? If God has given you an ability to do something, it is pride and foolishness not to do it. It is humility to step up and say, this is what God has called me to do, this is what God has given me to do. I don't feel worthy, but I'm going to go ahead and do it because it's what He's given me to do. That's not pride. That is humility, to actually step in to what God has given, to actually step into the resources that God has equipped you with, to step into the role that God has given you. That is humility. And somehow we twist it all up in our head. We have the permission to be who we are and who God has equipped and called us to be. And we have the ability to, in that being, to celebrate that. To celebrate what the King has made us and to celebrate what the King has given to us. Here's how it plays out. And I'll just give you an illustration from my own life. Being a pastor is kind of an interesting role. It's kind of an interesting job because every Sunday morning I gather a crowd of people who sit up in rows and listen to me talk. It's great. I get here at church, but I can't even get at home. And I've known guys who they're amazing communicators, they're amazing speakers, they're great storytellers, they can talk to people, who would not get up into this place, into this dynamic that we have here and speak. Because this is deemed arrogant. That I would stand on a platform and you would all sit in chairs and watch me talk to you. That this is me being arrogant. And not me personally, but that's how they viewed it for them. Like that's really a proud, arrogant thing to do, to stand up and to lecture people and make them sit in rows and listen. And so they wouldn't do it. And it's just not being who God equipped them to be, who they could be. I stand up here and have for the last 10 years, week after week after week. Was it like 500, 600 Sundays and coming up on something ridiculous like that? You know how much I think this is arrogant? For me, not at all. Because this is who God called me to be. This is what God called me to do. This is what the gift that God has given to me, is to stand up here and talk to you. I don't take that lightly. I appreciate the fact that you come and listen because I know I'm not that good at it. And I'm not fishing for compliments, so don't go there. I stand here because this is where God has placed me. And week after week, I stand here with fear and trepidation because I know I don't do the job that God could do were He to do it Himself. And I sometimes wonder, Lord, am I really getting the point across that you're trying to get across? Because I think I messed that one up. I think I muddied it up. I think I overthought that. I think I get it. I think I said something stupid that just kind of unraveled the entire thing. So I stand here genuinely in humility. And I know usually if you tell somebody you're humble, you're not. But you understand where I'm going. You understand my heart in this. It would be pride for me to stand here and say, this is what God has called me to do. This is what God has equipped me to do. But, wow, that's such a proud position. I'm just going to stand back and let somebody else do it. Because that says I think more about myself than you. It says I think more about myself than what God has called me to. And I know guys who wouldn't step up simply because, oh, I'm not worthy. No, you're not, but get over yourself. None of us are worthy to do this. But worthy doesn't come into it. Call, equip. The role that you're given, duty comes into it. And every area of our life is like that. You ever felt like a parent, like you had no idea what you're doing? It's like I can't wait till I'm a grandparent rather. I'll at least have mastered all of the questions. And maybe if I live long enough to be a great grandparent, I'll figure out some of the answers. But as a parent, first time around, you're still figuring out what the questions are. You have no idea about answers. I'm still learning the questions. You ever felt like that? Who's going to parent your children if you don't? Well, the state will if you let them. But it's your role to be a parent. Children, you go to school, and you're sitting there in your math class, and you're like, I hate math. You know, I feel it. I'm not a huge fan. But guess what your job is? It's to learn math. That's your role, is to be a student. Who's going to learn math for you if you don't? Who's going to learn Spanish if you don't? And who's to say that God isn't equipping you for something you're going to need to know down the road? That you actually may need to use math in your later life. I can't fathom how that would be, but it could happen. You may need to know Spanish later on in life. I don't know how, but it could happen. I took 3 years of Spanish. I took Spanish 1 twice and 2 once. I took geometry 1 twice. I get how, but that's your role. We need to just be who we are. We have the permission to be that, and we have the permission to celebrate that. I'm thankful every day that God lets me stand up here and do what I do, because I'm wired that way, and I enjoy talking to people. Most people I know are petrified to stand up and talk to people. I'm the crazy person who even at work goes to professional development classes so I can do it there. Because at work all I get to do is sit in my cubicle. Unless I take a class on public speaking. Then I get to talk. I enjoy the process. And so I celebrate what God has allowed me to do. It's tremendous to me. I know you may have a different impression, and I'm okay with that. But we have the permission to possess. We have the permission to speak. We have the permission to act. We have the permission to be. You have the permission to deal with the obstacles in your life. So deal with them. You have the opportunity, you have the permission to seize the opportunities in your life that God puts there. So seize them. Take the permission and act on it. Father, I love you. I thank you for your word. I thank you for the book of Esther. Lord, this has been such an amazing study. Lord, I'm thankful for the permission that you've given us. To be able to speak to you is no small thing. To be able to possess things that you have given us is no small thing. To be able to act on your behalf is no small thing. To be able to just be who we are, who you've made us to be, who you've equipped us to be, is an amazing thing. Father, would you help us this week to understand the level of permission that you've given us, and to go ahead and just do the things that need doing. Lord, the obstacles in our life that hold us back, may we see the permission to finally move past them. The opportunities that might propel us forward, may we see the permission to seize those. At all times aware that you are still the King and we are still your servants. But what a huge position it is to be that. Help us to see it, we pray in Jesus' good name.